at the YouTube of Alaki. So in the future, the first people who couldn't attend, they could check and see at Alaki YouTube channel. So let's start.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to today's American Society of Environmental History event, the second of 3 sessions on geography, geographers and historians, territory and nature in Latin America. The objective of these sessions is to share with the academic public our reflections on the theories, epistemologies, concepts, and methods with which we approach environmental history in Latin America. The third and final session will take place at the same time tomorrow. Special thanks are due to Marina Miralha of the Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento in Argentina for her work organizing these sessions. Today's sessions includes 4 speakers, potentially just 3. Our first speaker, Reinaldo Funes Monzote, will give a talk on Salvador Massip and the first flights to study the geography of Cuba. Our second speaker, Pedro Urquijo Torres, will discuss the contributions of the Berkeley School to the historical geography and environmental history of Latin America. Our third speakers, myself and Brasil-Machado, will present the theoretical and methodological links between historical geography and environmental history, and the current influences of Carl Sauer on the landscape investigation of the Brazilian Atlantic forest. So let me first introduce our first speaker. Reinaldo Funes Monzote is the director of the Geohistorical Research Program at the Antonio Núñez Jiménez Foundation in Cuba and professor of the history at the University of Havana. Author of From Rainforest to Cane Field, A Cuban Environmental History Since 1942, UNC Press 2008, won the Eleanor Melville Prize by Conference on Latin American History. He obtained the Casa de las Américas Award in 2019 with Nuestro Viaje a la Luna, la idea de la transformación de la naturaleza en Cuba durante la Guerra Fría. Our Journey to the Moon, the transformation of the idea of nature in Cuba during the Cold War. Funes Monzote researches mainly on Cuban and Caribbean environmental history and the history of science and technology in Cuba. He was also a visiting professor at the Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies, Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale from 2015-2020. Reinaldo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. And then I will share the screen. Let's see. Here is. Okay. Are you seeing the presentation? It's fine? Yes? Okay. My presentation will be a little more or less specific in 2 parts. First, I want to say thank you to Marina and Sandro to organize these 3 excellent panels and to share with our colleagues. As a historian, I always like to talk with geographers and talk about geography because it influenced very much my own profession, no? As a historian. And in this case, I will speak about Salvador Massip, a very famous and important Cuban geographer, but not only about Salvador Massip, also about his wife, Sara Isalgué, because they are the founding father and founding mother of the modern Cuban geography. And I think they influence the way we see our landscape, our nature, our geography. In the second half, at least in the second half of the 20th century. And then in the second part of my presentation, I will speak about something more specific that is about the first, what I consider the first flights to recognize and observe the Cuban landscape from an airplane, at least from a professional perspective. No, okay, okay, a little bit about Salvador and Sara. They both graduate at the University of Havana, Massip of Pedagogy in 1912, and later of Philosophy and Humanities in 1915. Sara also graduated in Pedagogy at the University of Havana in 1919. They both later, after Sara graduated, they went to the United States and they studied at Columbia University. They both hold a Master of Arts there. Massip studied in the Department of Geography and Geology and got the master in 1922. Sara did the studies of morphology at the teacher school between 1921 and 1922 and got the master in 1942. Massip, when they returned to Cuba, Massip established the chair of geography at the University of Havana in 1924 and was professor as Sara for many years. They both married in the same 1924, and Massip is considered the father of the modern Cuban geography. And I think we can say also that Sara deserved to be called the mother of modern geography in Cuba. Here, some picture in a conference, Sara presenting in a conference in the University of Marta Abreu at the center of Cuba, Las Villas, and a picture in Mexico. Here's some information about the academic trajectory of Massip in Cuba. As I mentioned, he was a professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities, teaching geography. And he taught, for example, economic geography after the 30s. He was a dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Humanities for many years, president of the Cuban Geographical Society, president of the National Conference of Geography in 1942, emeritus professor at the School of Geography, established in 1962, member of the National Commission of the New Academy of Science, 1962, and director of the Institute of Geography in the same Academy of Science. Here, he also participated in political activities. He was involved in the Cuban Revolution of 1933, also in the 1959 revolution. He was an ambassador in Mexico after 1933 revolution, and again, ambassador in Mexico after the 1959 revolution. Something that not many people know is that he proposed the creation of the Pan American Institute of Geography and History during the celebration of the Pan American Conference in Havana in 1928. This institution was created that in 1929, he was the first director, president of the institute. The headquarters was established in Mexico City. And I think we need maybe know a little more about this institution and its initial influence in this institution. He also was a professor in many institutions in Latin America and in the United States. Here you can see the list of some of the universities where he taught in different times. Here in the United States, for example, some of the universities teaching geography. And he also attended many international geographical conferences from the 20s to the 60s in many countries. They both travel a lot around the world and in Latin America. For example, they went to the International Conference of Geography in Rio de Janeiro in 1956. He wrote an excellent unpublished report. I have the manuscript. I hope to write something in the future about this visit, because they went a field trip to the Amazon, and I think it's something that I want to do in the future. But he attended many of these conferences. He was very updated about the geography, and they travel also around the world, but they also travel in Cuba, no, to different areas from the 20s to the 50s and 60s. Here is a photo of a field trip in the region of Zapata Swamp around 1950. That was very important in that moment, the geographical discussion. And it's the same place of the Bay of Piff, is why it's more famous in the United States and in other places in Latin America. And today is the biggest wetland in the Caribbean region. In my opinion, Massip represents the transition from geographical determinist influence towards a nationalistic and anti-imperialist geographical ideas in Cuba and also maybe in Latin America. For example, in 1939, in this paper, Geographical Factors of Cubanity, of Cubanness, I don't know how to say better. He wrote, in physics geography, I follow Professor Davis, William Morris Davis, and in human and social geography to Professor Semple. As we know, Helen's Churchill Semple is considered a representative of the geographical determinists in the United States with a lot of influence, no? But at the same time, he wrote this in 1938 in a translation of an article about the human geography and culture. Washington government and Wall Street capitalists and their native allies called communists, what is not another thing that the Conservation Institute of Hispanic American group in front of the threat of a complete absorption or a reduction to servitude by the Anglo-Saxon group. Then we can see in his work this transition from a kind of determinism to confrontation to the same deterministic idea, for example, in the relation between Cuba and the United States. And this is one of the best examples, his opening speech at the university academic year at the University of Havana, 1951-1952, about the geography and the resolution of the problem raised to the Cuban nation. And it's a very progressive statement that we made in that moment. For example, he highlighted the geographical factors in the Cuban economy, the necessity to accomplish studies connecting the natural and social factors, the challenge of the substitution of the country's wealth because of an extractive economy in favor of a few, and the vandalism of the exploitation of the natural resource. A country subject to a typically colonial regime where the advantage of capitalists make a rich a handful of millionaires that spend out of the country what the country produces. Meanwhile, the popular masses suffer a dreadful misery. He considered that few countries in the world hold the number of resources that Cuba has in a relatively small area, but also in few places exists a so brutal contrast between the extreme richness of a few and the extreme poverty of a more. And this is why they call for a solution for this problem in the Cuban geography and the Cuban society. They claim for the urgency to orientate policies for planning in Cuba. They use a sample of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Puerto Rican Planning Board, the recommendation of Truslow Mission of the World Bank for Cuba, the 5-year plan of the Soviet Union, and experience in other countries. And he mentioned between the plan for Cuba some points, for example, the physical and moral rehabilitation of the Cuban people, intensification of salubrity, and new orientation of education, and agrarian reform. That was a very important call from the 1933 revolution, and before, the diversification of the production and self-sufficiency in food production, and a gradual industrialization of the country. And this explains why he supported the Cuban 1959 revolution. He went to exile just the year before to Puerto Rico, where he was teaching at the University of Puerto Rico, and he back to Cuba, and he supported the revolution and participate in many of the institutions created of the revolution to promote the geographical profession, and the role of the geography in the new transformation of Cuba. Here, for example, he was the first director of the new Institute of Geography and Geology, here with Sara Isalgue, another famous scientists and geographers and geologists in that moment. And with them is Antonio Núñez Jiménez, that was maybe the most famous disciple of both. He made the thesis at the university with Sara Isalgué, and he participated in the revolution, was the case that mentioned yesterday, Michael. And it's a very important relation between this professor and the disciple, Antonio Núñez Jiménez, here at the Academy of Science, and they continue working for the Cuban geography for many years. Here, Sari Salgué in the 1980s doing a field research, and they both participate in the Academy of Science and the new Atlas of Cuba. And then in my second part is in relation with this document that I found. It's unpublished. I think I consider it was the first flight to recognize and observe the Cuban landscape from the airplane by a geographer. And he wrote this during the years 1931, 1932. This is one of the interesting precedents, because in 1929, Massip invited Edwin Rice, that was also graduate in Columbia University a year after Massip, and he created a new form of cartography. And Massip inviting him in 1929 to make a map of Cuba using this kind of the model that the new method that Rice created to represent the relief. And they use in that moment topographic maps, other available source and of course the massive knowledge of the Cuban geography, but they not mention aerial photograph or other this kind of resource to prepare this map. And this is one of the reasons why I consider that this map, what I am talking today, are the first. And also because at the beginning he mentioned his direct source of inspiration, that was these experiments by George Claude, that is a famous inventor from France. He is considered the French Edison, and he came to Cuba, and it's something also very interesting to make this kind of experiment. He built in the Bay of Matanzas the first prototype of a plant to produce electric energy from the sea based on the ocean thermal energy conversion concept. And this plant produced energy with a low pressure turbine. And Massip wrote that Claude mentioned of the existence of maritime terraces in Cuba based in his exploration of the coastline from the yacht Jamaica, the Claude's yacht Jamaica, inspired him to make a visual or observation from an airplane. And he considered that was the main resource to demonstrate that affirmation by Claude about the system of this kind of terraces. One of the reasons why he selected Cuba to make this kind of experiment. Then this explains also that the first flight were around Havana in the coastline, trying to demonstrate these Claude's ideas, the topography of the north coast of Havana, and also the study of the Mariel region. And they made this in this airplane that was mostly for observation. But later he made another longer trip to recognize, and with the particular objective to study the geography of Cuba from Havana to Santiago de Cuba in a Ford trimotor. Here is the itinerary of this flight with 7 stops, and here the time, the arrive. He write very interesting information in every flight: the pilot name, the airplane model, the depart time, the altitude, the objective, the arrive time, flight time, the weather, visibility, observation. And as a general description, he in every of these flights, he described the physical geography. Frequently, he made reference to the geomorphology concepts applied to the Cuban landscape. During the flight, he used topographical maps. In some moment, he mentioned this, and to correct some of the mistakes he found. Many of the observations were dedicated to the human geography of different regions. This is one of the characteristics more interesting for me as a historian. And this includes urban and rural landscape. And in many moments of the report, he criticized the Cuban crash crop economy based on sugarcane, the large-scale agriculture, in times of a very severe crisis in the Cuban economy and decline of the sugar industry after the 1925 crack and the influence in Cuba. One of the first observation was about this, the Valley of Guinness, that he considered a beautiful garden, and then after, during the trip, he was comparing many other places with the pattern of the Valley of Guinness. He said the Valley of Guinness only can compare with the beautiful garden, awake a sentiment of admiration for human labor and natural beauty. But just close from Guinness start another very different landscape surrounded and domained by the sugarcane plantation. For example, he wrote, the trees were cut down to plant cane around this town, Nueva Paz, and remaining of primitive forests are only present inside the urban center. The town seems like an oasis into a sugarcane desert. Here, through Zapata Swan, Cienfuegos, he, in the return trip, wrote more about the Zapata Swan. But here again, he made the comparison with Guinness from Cienfuegos to Santa Claras in the center of Cuba, and then from Santa Claras to Morón, La Trocha region that he considered a perfect plain of Meyerhoff. Meyerhoff was another famous geographer from the United States, and he also came to Cuba in the 30s to work with Massip in the new observation of the Cuban landscape. And he always described the huge deforestation of these areas to produce sugarcane. For example, we notice extensive deforested space where appears large sugarcane fields. The clearance of the forest was relatively recent. The limit between the forest and the sugarcane is almost always a straight line. Later, from Morón to Camagüey, for example, he continues mention this prevalence of the sugarcane. For example, the Cunagua mountain looks like an Einzelberg that rise within sugarcane fields. South of Cunagua, the ramification of the swamp penetrate within the sugarcane fields. There are Cayos forest keys, but the eagerness to plant cane has been so big that its vegetation was destroyed and replaced by the sugarcane. And they repeat this kind of experience during many moments of the flight, no? In some case, he observed extensive sugarcane fields that looks abandoned as a consequence of the harvest restrictions and the crisis. He mentioned, for example, these are the lands of La Trocha, open to agriculture around 20 years to cultivate sugarcane. A few forests, the deforestation of this region has been relentless. And again, from Camagüey Las Tunas, here he observed a change of the landscape from the sugarcane to the cattle ranch economy. And it's interesting because he still in that moment used some of these determinist notion about the influence of the relief, for example, or the plains in the economy of a region. This is why he wrote this about Camagüey. For example, Camagüey is the only relevant urban center in a large radio. Rural life at the plain remain limited to a second term by Camagüey city. With some relief, rural life could be more intense. Penny Plain has produced the city. Physics geography determines the condition of human geography. And then they describe some of the cattle ranch landscape and continue with the sugarcane, all in this area, the east of Cuba, that was where many US sugarcane corporation established a huge plantation during the first years of the century, especially during the First World War. And this is why he described permanently this huge transformation in that areas. In some moment, he again compared with Guinness. For example, small crop are alternate with sugarcane field and cattle ranch. I get the impression of the region with a more equilibrated economy, since as Guinness Valley with relief. That was the kind of ideal that he was proposing, and not only him, many other Cuban economists and writers in that moment have the same kind of feeling, criticizing the effects, the impact of the sugarcane plantation over the Cuban economy and the domain of the Cuban economy by the big US corporation. And that this was the end of the flight from Holguín to Santiago de Cuba. And here are some of the observation again about the deforestation of this area, the prevalence of the sugar cane, that he always said when the deforestation looks something recent in the different areas. Then the return flight, he also wrote some of the complementary observation during the return flight, and sometimes more than in the first flight. For example, in this from Holguín to Las Tunas, he wrote about comparing that locality, the observation of that locality with the transition of the Cuban economy. He said, he wrote, for example, there are here the stage of the region's economy. First, the high forest fell for sugarcane. Second, a sugarcane field which thoroughly produced good profits. Third, the sugarcane field was abandoned because of the harvest restriction or decadence of the industry. Fourth, the use of the former sugarcane lands to promote a diverse farm. The last stage represents the current moment of the Cuban economy. The lesson won't be clearer. The laborious Cuban farmers took advantage of the remains of the irrational exploitation of the soils to develop a farm that represents in small size the recovery of our economy. Also, the observation over the Zapata Swamp were very interesting, and that finished the longer flight, from Havana to the east of Cuba to Santiago, from Santiago to La Habana. But later, he made another flight in the Havana region in September 25, with a goal to study of the coastline of the north of the western region and topography from Havana Bay to Yumurí Valley, close to the Matanzas Bay, and again with a very interesting observation and also observation of Havana. For example, the relation between the city of the population of Havana and the Havana Bay, and the size of the Havana Bay, the supply of water, other geographical information that, of course, he had already, he observed directly the vestige of the Claudet's experiment close to the Matanzas Bay. And here another observation, he observed, for example, the recreation houses of the Cuban president. And in different moments, he said, why is important the airplane for this kind of observation? For example, close to Matanzas, about the valley of Yumurí, he wrote, the great advantage of the airplane is to observe all the Yumurí Valley with just a glance. From Montserrat or La Cumbre, we can only see partial views of the valley. And this is another flight, October 20 of 1931, to the south of Havana, again with a very interesting observation about the physical geography and human geography. This is another flight in the region of Havana, Matanzas, the better study, of course. He lived in Havana, and most of the academics were in Havana also. And this is the last flight from these years, a flight to the Isla de Pinos, the Pines Island at the south of Cuba. And he also made very interesting description. And I want to finish with this, that he wrote during this flight over over this island at the south of Cuba. The impression produced by the vision of a complete geographical unit is very deep. Here is the island of Isla de Pinos. Like we have seen many times represented in maps, it appears in the reality in front of our eyes. However, it is not represented, but is presented. It is an indefinable emotion which brings a sediment of surprise, admiration, and happiness. We experience the satisfaction of proof that for more artificial could be the knowledge and life. There is in both a bottom of reality. And I think this document is very interesting, and how this changed the perspective of the Cuban landscape, or how this reaffirmed what many people already know about the transformation of the Cuban economy during the first years of the 20th century, because as a consequence of this monocrop economy. And we can put this in dialogue with many other sources, and how this changed the perspective of a geographer, as happened later after the 30s, of course, with the new resource, with the new tools that we have to make our geographers and other scientists have to make our work. Okay, thank you very much for the attention. I extend a little more the presentation as the request of Alex. Of course, excuse me, because it was my own translation, and maybe in some moment the translation is not the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reinaldo. Gracias.
Okay, Alex, I continue now with the presentation. Okay, I will present Ana and Alex. Is Pedro around or not? Okay, I'm sorry. Ana Brasil-Machado is a geographer interested in the relationship between cities, nature, law, and planning. She has a bachelor, master's, and doctorate in geography from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She is currently a professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the same university. According her interest in the subdiscipline of historical geography, she's investigating the relationship between sour approach and the landscape of the Atlantic forest in this moment. And she will present together with Ale Solórzano. He is a historical geographer and historical ecologist of the Atlantic forest biome. Okay.
Biomes.
Biomes. He holds a bachelor's degree from the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, a master in botany from the National School of Tropical Botany at the Rio de Janeiro Botanical Garden Research Institute, and a PhD in ecology from the University of Brasilia, with a sandwich doctorate at Colorado State University. I would like to have the same kind of formation as you, Alex. I'm only a historian, unfortunately. He is a professor at the Geography and Environment Department at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Currently, he is researching forest landscape transformation in order to understand the socio-ecological dynamics and the result of this historical ecological process, and the ways in which culture is inscribed in the forest landscape, producing novel ecosystem and biocultural diversity. Welcome, both.
Thank you very much, Reinaldo. I'm going to share the presentation for me and Ana, and I'll be giving the floor to Ana first, sorry. So Ana's gonna, the dynamic is gonna be, Ana's gonna start the presentation, and then I'm gonna continue from the half and end the presentation. So Ana, you may begin the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Reinaldo. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the session organizer, Marina Miralha and Sandro Dutra. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So our presentation is entitled Traveling Paths Between Historical Geography and Environmental History, Theoretical and Methodological Perspectives for the Interpretation of Brazilian Atlantic Forest Landscapes, and was developed based on a dialogue between Carl Sauer's proposals for his historical geography and the work developed by Labert in recent years. Okay. Today, despite the different views, we know that forests are not native or untouched. Forests are cultural landscapes. They are a product of human and non-human association. Many works have already been carried out on Brazilian forests and on the Atlantic forest, including perspectives on environmental history and historical geography. These works, however, privilege the great history, the big history, the most remarkable moments of this landscape's transformation, emphasizing the demands of economic cycles and the water crisis that results from the forest suppression. In this sense, the minor history or a material history of the landscape and non-human agency has received zero emphasis. Materiality, small traces, but also plants, slopes, river, and some social groups still have little place in research of the Atlantic forest's transformation. Next, Alex. Okay. Carl Sauer made an important contribution to the development of historical geography, interested in the environment during the last century. The historical geography proposed by Sauer is a form of description interested in the location and in the connection of the phenomena in space over time. Cultural landscapes, physical manifestations of material culture etched on the land describe the economics of cultural groups, their tools, their shelters, their food, their transportation. However, in order to understand this landscape, it is necessary to investigate the processes that constituted them, a detective type task, which involves connecting clues or evidence according to the author. Carl Sauer and the Berkeley School had many disciples in the United States and Mexico, for example, which coincides with Sauer's own focus of studies. On the other hand, Carl Sauer's work received and receives little attention from scholars of an environmental historical geography in Brazil, with rare exceptions located in the 70s and the 80s. And most of them are interested in Amazonia, and only one thesis considers the Southeast region. So southeastern forests, the Atlantic forest or Mata Atlântica, have not yet had many encounters with Carl Sauer's approach. Although in a preliminary way, we can present three hypotheses for this mismatch. The first is an anti-Americanism posture of Brazilian intellectuals in the last century. The second is the prominence of the French school of geography in Brazil, which is somehow pose problems similar to those of the Berkeley School in focusing on cultural regions. And the last hypothesis is that Brazilian historical geography emphasized the study of cities and the urban network and gave little emphasis to other landscapes. In this sense, how can Sauer's proposals help to understand the landscapes of the Atlantic forest from a historical cultural geography approach? Next, please. Okay. So our goal is to explore different theoretical methodological paths for understanding the landscape history of the Atlantic forest, taking Sauerian historical geography as its starting point, navigating the currents of contemporary historical ecology, and launching itself to meet new theoretical conceptual references such as novel ecosystems and social ecological systems. Here, we will emphasize some methodological aspects presented by Carl Sauer and how they have been applied in research on the Atlantic forest landscape that are carried out by the Laboratory of Biogeography and Historical Ecology, LABE. The first of these aspects is the concept of cultural landscape. The first element to emphasize in relation to its formulation of the cultural landscape is its stance against environmental determinism. The Franco-Germanic influences and his field experiences led Sauer to look for alternatives that challenge deterministic thinking about the environment. Sauer found that the importance of human action in the production and transformation of the landscape was much more significant than the influence of the environment on land use. For him, geography should be the spatial history of culture. In other words, these transformative human activities and not the influence of natural elements that occupy a central position in landscape studies. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, the landscape, the cultural landscape is the result, as you can see in the image. The second aspect is that cultural landscape was a unifying category. The choice of this object guarantees at the same time distinction in relation to other disciplines and overcoming the threat of the division between physical geography and human geography. It is therefore a useful formulation in an attempt to overcome the dichotomy between society and nature, which has been addressed in recent years by different fields such as environmental humanities and multi-species approach. The third aspect is the historical perspective. There was a need to understand time as a non-recurrent time. So cultural landscapes were not static. They change as the societies that created them also change. And each society, as well as each cultural landscape, has its own history. For Sauer, the present landscape is the historical consequence of the interaction between the organism and the environment. The last aspect is morphology. The landscape is a concrete and perceived reality. It is the material result of the interactions between the different physical elements and between these and human groups. It is understandable in time, but traceable in the space where it is located. In this sense, the landscape morphology allows a synthetic approach to human action on the nature landscape. Next, please. Another aspect to emphasize is the role of fieldwork in Sauer's formulation. In his words, the reconstruction of past culture areas is a slow task of detective work as to the collecting of evidence and weaving it together. In this way, the fieldwork was composed of different techniques from different disciplinary traditions. Observation played a central role and included excavations, giving rise to what Sauer called archaeogeography. So ruins, artifacts, techniques, plant species, geomorphological forms, and their spatial patterns were observed. In addition to observation in archival documentation, fieldwork also sought to multiply points of view through informants, reports, oral history, and photographs production. Next, please.
Okay, so thank you, Anna. This is where you pass me the baton, and I can continue to connect the historical geography, environmental history, and historic ecology that from our lab's point of view, they have much more in common than dissimilarities. And this commonality is the landscape perspective, as Anna has been presenting regarding Sauer's point of view. Therefore, despite the differences between these three fields, they offer fundamental tools for the historical understanding of the relationships between cultures and nature. In addition to the temporal approach, which is, paramount to all of them, such fields are open to interdisciplinarity, emphasize the landscape as a fundamental category of analysis, and operate from an evidential paradigm, observing different signs such as documents, landscapes, forms, and species assemblages, which is something Sauer also liked to do. So how have we been applying this landscape perspective from this historical geography point of view to interpret the Atlantic forest landscape? So we do have a basis of documental and iconographic evidence to understand landscape change. We are strongly based in fieldwork in order for us to be able to find this material evidence that is inscribed or etched in the landscape. For example, ruins of old farms, residences, aqueducts, bridges, ancient road networks, charcoal production sites, and other archaeological evidence. And another main axis of investigation is, and everything is kind of overlapped and happening at the same time, is the biological evidence of landscape transformation, where structure and species composition can tell a lot of what happened in the forest, especially thinking about forest landscapes, forest ecosystems. And another part is how exotic species introduction history and its current distribution can help understand the spatial patterns that we're observing in the current landscape. So they help us tell more in-depth stories of human occupation and human use of landscapes. And kind of a synthesis of this triple investigation is understanding the historical production and distribution of novel ecosystems, which is a novel concept in itself. It kind of started being developed in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in a very simple way, it's a way to understand how social and ecological interaction can lead to the production of these novel species assemblages that are self-regulated. Somebody has, oh, there you go. So basically they're a form of self-regulated nature and human intervention. So I really won't be able to get into the details of this concept, but I'd rather show you guys what we're talking about. So what we're gonna do right now is gonna show this evidential paradigm that we've been basing ourselves in. This map of the Rio de Janeiro forest remnants is very interesting because, first of all, back in the 1500s, all of the state of Rio de Janeiro, which is this map, was covered in green, which is covered in Atlantic forest, and now less than 30% forest cover remains in the state. And what this map shows us is where forest occurs is usually where it's harder for humans to occupy the landscape. So it's mostly mountainous terrain. So we have here Serra do Mar, all the way ranging from the eastern portion of the Rio de Janeiro state, all the way to the central and northern, Serra da Mantiqueira, up in the northwestern portion, and the coastal massifs of Tijuca and Pedra Branca. And here has been our open site laboratories that we've been investigating for the past 2 decades, I would say, summing Rogério's work with my work and the work of the students at the Laboratório de Geography of Cuba Histórica. So we have these close-up views of the Pedra Branca on the left and Tijuca massifs, Serra do Tinguá, which is another important study area and different type of landscape. It's more peri-urban and rural instead of this more urban forest completely surrounded by city. And another portion of the Serra do Mar, which is Serra da Estrela, which connects 2 important parts of the Baixada Fluminense, Magé, and the upper part where Petrópolis, and these 2 mountainous areas have been cut by ancient paths and road networks that connected the Vale do Paraíba with the city of Rio de Janeiro. So this has been our main study sites. And this is what we're going to show is the evidence is the different types of evidences that we've been encountered in the forest landscape. And what we the detective type work that Anna was explaining, it's actually really time consuming. We've invested hundreds, if not thousands of hours of field work in these forests. Sometimes closer at home, sometimes it's a 30-minute drive and we're already in the forest, sometimes it's a little bit further. But you know, in this case, in the Tijuca forest, which is really like urban trails are cutting these forests, and hidden under the forest canopy, we can find the ruins of old coffee farms, which is where the entire coffee plantation in Brazil started. One of the starting places was in the Tijuca forest here in the city of Rio de Janeiro. So we still have these ancient remains, and the vegetation surrounding it also has very interesting characteristics that are a little bit different from the surrounding areas. Another interesting chapter of the history of the southeastern Mata Atlântica is the context in the 1900s, 1800s of the energy demand for charcoal production. So these two mountainous massifs in Rio de Janeiro, we found over 1,500 charcoal production sites that not only is the evidence of this work completely covered by forest cover today, back when it was being produced by an invisible population that left basically no written document whatsoever. So most of the history of the ex-enslaved populations that carried out this work is literally inscribed through their work in the forest landscapes. And it's been a very interesting part of the Labè's work to recover. And it's interesting, the hardest part is it's taken a lot of time and training to actually train like the eye, train the understanding of the terrain. Literally what Roderick Nash said, reading the landscape as a document, so reading the physical forms of the landscape in order to understand the small marks, and then hidden in these plateaus under the forest cover, we can find the charcoal remains. So charcoal production is an interesting chapter of the environmental history and the historical geography of these urban and peri-urban forests, but also the introduction of exotic species. And if they can be studied as separate events, we can also understand them as completely interconnected due to their spatial overlap. So nowadays we're understanding that these two chapters are important drivers of the Atlantic forest landscape change, and they're part of what we're calling the cultural forests, that is composed also of biocultural diversity containing multi-species relations. So this figure illustration, dynamic illustration, can show a charcoal kiln, how it was produced up until the mid 1950s, and then after that, in the 80s to the present, forest regenerated on itself, didn't need any assisted regeneration because of the technique the charcoal producers used. They didn't fell the entire forest tract. They most likely used tree sizes that were more manageable and left the larger trees. So that's one interesting hypothesis that helped forest regeneration and allowed for biomass resilience, which is an ecological concept that means it's faster for secondary forests to incorporate biomass and recover biomass in the forest. So nowadays, what we have are the forests, but slope cuts and this charcoal plateaus are the evidences that we still find in the forest, but it's hidden. It's completely hidden. It's taken some time to train ourselves to be able to find these. So a more detailed reading of the landscape reveals these legacies imprinted in the forests of Rio de Janeiro. So this is a clear illustration of Gabriel, and I think it's Rogério on this plateau. You can see the slope cut and this level area. We have these dark earth, which can also be classified as anthropogenic dark earth, not the same anthropogenic dark earth found in the Amazon. It has different origin, different history, but it has different chemical properties that makes it different than the soils that are not tainted by this charcoal remains. And let me show you this video that I have that can exemplify how difficult and hidden these. So we can find, like in some places, buried under a layer of earth, a large amount of charcoal fragments. And when I zoom out from this site that we found, it was actually a series of charcoal sites. You can barely see Vicente on the left. It's completely covered. We can barely. I was barely able to show you guys how the terrain was level. It's very hidden. So this is the type of detective work that we've been conducting under the leadership of Rogério, finding these charcoal production sites. And so another chapter is the Jackfruit Novel Ecosystem, which is a part of my research, trying to, first of all, understand how this species that is exotic, and because it's exotic, and this nature versus like nature-human dichotomy that still is being emphasized by park managers, it's actually seen as a very bad species for the forest. But due to geographical and historical investigation, we've been understanding how they have overlapping spatial distributions. So this image in the center here, so this is the jackfruit on the left with these little jackfruits that are gonna become maybe 20-pound, 30-pound fruits, even more potentially. And on the middle here, we can see Vicente with the GPS marking a point. The point is actually an overlap, an intersection of a jackfruit tree behind him with a pretty decent girth. It has maybe a yard or more of diameter, indicating that's been there for a while. So its age is also indicative of its time it's spending in the forest. And he is also on a charcoal plateau. You can't really see it, but I remember this photo. So we are finding these overlapping stories of charcoal production and jackfruit, especially in the Tijuca forest, where there are more jackfruits present for some reason. Maybe it was because of the coffee farms that were surrounding the forest, the amount of people that were entering the forest and using the forest resources. There's a lot of different hypotheses for that. In other parts of Rio de Janeiro, Pedra Branca, we can still see active banana production as part of this landscape history, still currently etching itself in the landscape. So, and most of these forest dwellers are the direct descendants of the ex-enslaved populations, which we also call the Quilombola populations. So this is also an interesting part of the hidden histories of the Atlantic forests in the urban forests of Rio de Janeiro. And we can see this mosaic of novel ecosystems, hybrid ecosystem, managed banana plantations, conserved ecosystems in the Pedra Branca currently in the 21st century. And parsimon production together with banana production, so they're being consortiated, and these almost extractivist management style forest systems, and people are still living in the forests. And an important part of our work is actually trying to understand the ecological dynamics of what's going on. What are the species, what are the tree species, because they represent most of the forest biomass. What's the diversity, what's the composition, how much of the species is historical, has been there for hundreds of years, how much of it is novel assemblages of native species, novel assemblages of exotic species. So everything is kind of jumbled up. We're trying to understand that with different ecological indicators. And another part, which is Xinguá, which is the more hinterland Serra do Mar part. So we've been trying to understand also how road networks can tell stories. So this is the Estrada do Comércio, which is an ancient road from the 19th century, early 19th century, that connected the Baixada, which is, you know, the part, today part of the metropolitan area of Rio de Janeiro with Vale do Paraíba, because that's where coffee production expanded towards. So it was an important connection to be able to, the producers ship their production of coffee towards the main metropolis and then to the main ports and export it off seas. So roads tell interesting stories, and along these roads, the paths tell interesting stories. So these paths these plants, they can tell specific stories of people that use these ancient networks of roads and left behind exotic species, native fruit species along the road, exotic fruit species. So they're telling interesting stories about human use of the landscape, and they're also an interesting way to study historical geography on the basis of landscape investigation. So this is also very Sowerian mode of investigating landscape. Church ruins and people tell stories. So at the top of the mountain along this commerce road, there was an ancient village from the early 18th century that by the late 19th century was abandoned, and the church was abandoned. And we can find the remains completely hidden in a forested area, which is today in the middle of one of the most preserved biological reserves of the Mata Atlântica, which is Rebio Tinguá. So today we could only access it because we were doing research and we were allowed to visit it, but it's completely closed even for visitation. It's not a park, it's a reserve. And also people tell stories. So another part of data collection and basically just trying to understand what's going on in the landscape is talking to the local inhabitants. And oral history and oral geography have been important research elements to understand how not only they perceive their own landscape, but to tell hidden stories that we won't able to discover on our own, and that there is no written documents. And to understand, for example, current political ecological issues. In this case, for example, a lot of them are, there's a division in the population. Some want the biological reserve to remain a reserve. Some want them to be recategorized into a national park, which allows for visitation. So this is interesting. There are ongoing debate going on. So images and field sites on themselves also tell stories. So the use of iconography, ancient maps, they can also help us tell these stories, and going to these field sites and, obviously comparing images and then also collecting botanical samples. All of these are elements to help us tell these stories. So this is the same farm that we see here on the left, Anna giving her presentation with these images on the field site. So this is the Fazenda Bernardino, which produced different types of gêneros alimentícios, didn't come to mind the translation, different types of food, basically. This is an area view of the Fazenda Bernardino. It's unfortunate that it's a very rich archaeological site that's completely degraded because there's basically a poor historical preservation in the municipality of Nova Iguaçu, where this historical site is found. So these are some images of the Fazenda São Bernardino. It's a really beautiful, interesting site surrounded by this kind of mixed matrix of forest fragments with different types of land use. Also, water tells us stories. So Tinguá was a very important, it remained forest because back in the 19th century, the Brazilian emperor decreed it to be a protected area in the 19th century because the city of Rio de Janeiro was having water issues because of all of the coffee farms. So they needed water from the Serra do Tinguá, which is a little bit further. So in the 19th century, they started to channel this water and to make huge reservoirs that are, and this is still part of the Rio de Janeiro system of water. It's from the 19th century, but it's still feeding Rio de Janeiro's metropolis demand for water. So also water tells us stories. In the Serra da Estrela, we're going to a more recent chapter, and I'm going to finish soon, I hope, because I'm almost 30 minutes presentation. We're seeing the overlap of ancient roads, farms, charcoal sites, and so all of these evidences that I've been describing, and they're still currently being used. So we see here the Caminho do Ouro, which is a road that used in this 18th century and 17th century to for the gold mines in Minas Gerais to be able to transport the gold towards the ports of Rio de Janeiro. And today it's part of a system of trails. And the charcoal sites that we see here are being used as, you know, religious use currently in the forest. So, and this is another interesting chapter, how also another interesting type of forest use has been the religious use, not only of Afro-Brazilian religions. Here on the right part, we can see uma oferenda, ebó, which is type of practice done by Afro-Brazilian religions, but also by neo-Pentecostal Christian religions also have been using the forest as healing sites, the forest as prayer sites, and they've been using the plateaus left by the charcoal producers back in the 19th and 20th century. And we're trying to understand these current dynamics. It's part of one of our students' undergraduate thesis. So in terms of concluding remarks, and I'm going to try to go through these sort of quickly. How does Sauer, and I put and Ballet, and William Ballet, because after his 2006 paper where he kind of determined what's the research program of historic ecology, we start to see even more connection between historical geography from, you know, Sauerian school with current historic ecology, and we know there is a mixed match, a mesh between historical ecology and historical geography, and current Brazilian historical geography being done by our lab. So landscape detective work type investigation complemented by documents, maps, and interviews. But I would say that our main focus has been this landscape detective work. We're not interested in differentiating landscape as Sauer was, but revealing the hidden history beneath forest cover. We're more interested in connecting the different cultural and biophysical elements and discovering the social ecological links. And the apparent similarity of forests from a view of the canopy is a reality quite different from the more open formations on which Sauer worked on, and from those agrarian landscapes studied by European geographers who initially formulated the cultural landscape concept. So studying dense Atlantic forest in itself presents its own set of challenges in applying this framework developed by Sauer in another ecological context. The landscape does not stand out like the European cultivated fields, the formations in the US or Mexico. It's a lot of it is really hidden, and you have to spend a lot of time under dense forest cover just trying to figure out what's going on. So it's necessary to descend under the canopy and adopt a point of view closer to the terrain. To investigate vegetation, soil, charcoal fragments, and ruins barely visible to the terrain. That is so the importance of historical informed environmental investigation as a tool for landscape management. So this is an important part of where we are right now. So all of these different elements that we've been understanding, and especially elements that are interesting for park managers, such as exotic invasive species, you know, historically informing park managers to make their decisions has been an integral part of the research. I would say more the extension of the research we've been doing. And last but not least, so charcoal production and jackfruit novel ecosystems as main historical and social ecological findings of Rio urban forest. And just to close this, if I can synthesize everything in one simple phrase, one takeaway point, Atlantic forest as a place not only of connection or reconnection, but also as a place to rescue our own cultural heritage. Thank you very much. And I apologize for passing a little bit more than 30 minutes. And I guess this is where I'm the session presenter. I will be opening the, the session for Q&A. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here and taking your time to listen to our presentations. Pedro Urquijo wasn't able to join us, so that's why me, Ana, and Reinaldo had a little bit more of extra time to be a little bit more comfortable and speak a little bit longer. I hope it wasn't too tiring for you guys, and we will be happy to answer any questions.
Alex, I think that Andy and Sam. Right?
Yeah, Sam. Sure. Hey, Sam.
Hi.
Go ahead, Sam.
Thank you both for this. I have a lot of things I want to say, but I'll just have one question for each of you. And so first for Reinaldo, I'll throw right back at you what you asked me yesterday. And that is that Massip is at Columbia in 1922. Who else is at Columbia in that same time? None other than Gilberto Freire. So I'm curious if the two of them had any connection at Columbia and whether Freire might have been influential in Massip's work. So yeah, if you can say anything about that. And then for Alex, I was going to bring this up anyways, and then you said it as your final slide, but you had said at one point earlier in your talk that the forest, you used the word connect, the verb connect, to describe the role of the Serra da Estrela forest between Magé and Petrópolis. And you kind of just said that like casually, but I heard something more important than that. So is that something you're thinking of theoretically, conceptually, the idea of forest as something connecting more than just like an emotional attachment that you have to it? So I think in like the spatial theorist Kevin Lynch would be someone that comes to mind. As there are certain types of places that unite, other types of places that divide. So are you working with this idea of forests as something that connect rather than divide in anything more, a more conceptual framework? So yeah, and I'll write you guys with other thoughts and questions that I had, but I will just leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Maybe we can do like a round of, I don't know, 2 or 3. What do you think, Marina? I know somebody else, Andy Acosta.
Yes, well, thanks so much for the presentation. It's what's both of the three of you actually presented very well and clear. I have a question for you, Alex and Anna. So you mentioned through the presentation, the importance of the forest and also on a forest as a cultural landscape. I wonder if you encountered more or evidence of forest management by these groups that you mentioned, especially charcoal makers. It was traditionally this type of forest used for energy was traditionally managed in Europe. Of course, a different type of context, a different type of forest, but it was managed using different techniques. For example, cobbicing. So have you encountered any of those evidence of any woodland management?
Okay.
Is that clear, the question, or not?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you, Andy. Maybe Reinaldo, you can start answering Sam, and then me and Anna can answer Sam and Andy.
Yes, no. Thank you very much, Sam. I would like to find something, will be great. No, not for the moment. I found in Freire, years later in Nordeste, he mentioned a famous book by Ramiro Guerra, Azúcar y Colonización en las Antillas, Sugar and Colonization in the Antilles. And I found that that is a very interesting connection between Cuban and Brazilians. But I found much more about Brazil in general in Massip. And I will look closer to, well, but it will be great if I find that they met in Colombia in that moment, no? He wrote, as I told, about this visit in Rio de Janeiro and the Amazon, and he wrote also about coffee. He wrote about rubber and some of the topics about Brazil. And I think it's a very interesting connection. As I mentioned before, also a connection with Mexico, no? It's really interesting in Salvador Massip. But will be great if I find more. And I appreciate very much your suggestion about Freire and Massip at the same time in Colombia. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so Anna, do you want to start answering and then I can compliment you, or vice versa?
Okay, that's okay, I can start. Sam, I've never thought about this forest as Kevin Lynch, but we just published an article with Vicente, who I think is here, I don't know, about the Serra da Estrela as a limit or an edge, as Kevin Lynch said. But then it starts to be a path, because people started to work there and to construct the roads, the different roads, to bring the gold from Minas Gerais. So sometimes these forests, these serras, these mountains, are edges, and sometimes they are paths. It depends on how much work is attributed to the landscape in this sense. Alex.
Yeah, so I guess I haven't really thought about, I'm putting here on the chat the link for it was published in the special edition organized by Sandro, the Solsha magazine, which is the Sociedade Latino-Americana de História Ambiental, Caribeña Latino-Americana. But I guess I wasn't really thinking about connection of places. I think when I said Magén, Petrópolis, yeah, it's kind of like this very steep mountainous area that has been, different roads have been used in a very short geographical area, starting back from the 1700s, and then the Nova Estrada, and then that was kind of abandoned, and now there's a new route that connects Petrópolis, which is literally the city of Peter, which was the emperor, so it's his city. It was constructed to be like his residence during the summer because of the weather. It's in the mountains. It's, you know, very nice views, pristine forests and all. But before that, have been used by you know, different social agents, especially with the Minas Gerais back in the 1700s and early 1800s. Our connection, the connection that I was mentioning, so it was more of this kind of reappropriation of current forests for spiritual connection. So it's another type of connection. In a sense, it does connect places, Sam, if you think about it. So if any religious practitioner, be it Candomblé, be it the new Pentecostal evangelical, if they're going to the forest, it's to connect their terrain selves with the extra-terrain dimension. So it is connecting places. It's maybe not connecting physically places geographically, but there is this, maybe one can explore the idea of the spiritual geography connecting these echelons and dimensions. But for them, it's like the interesting narrative there is that there's territorial disputes currently going on in this forest that has, you know, charcoal production and this ancient road network used by the coal workers, the ouro, my gold miners, yeah, gold miners, there you go, the gold miners. So they don't even know about that history. They don't even know that where they're practicing their current religion has been used for charcoal production 100 years ago. It's kind of beyond. It doesn't. It's not being discussed. What's being discussed is that this is the territory of the evangelical, and this is the territory of the candomblé, and this is the territory of the ayahuasca people that are using the forest. So it's quite interesting, and it's very interesting because it's a very small section of forest between Magé and Petrópolis. So it is this kind of in-between place that been aggregating these different religious phenomenon, and it's a very small place with all this interesting things going on. And that's, you know, and we would have never seen that if our landscape detective work wasn't being practiced. So we were looking for something else. So this ancient evidence of charcoal producers, or, you know, or other type of evidences, or coffee farms, or whatnot. And then we found something else. And then after finding that, park managers came to talk to us. So we want to understand what you guys are finding. So just these social ecological connections have been this really interesting part of what we've been investigating, being back into the 1800s history and connection of people with forests, or, you know, what's going on today. And in my understanding, everything is kind of overlapped. But thank you for the idea of connecting in more of this geographical connecting spaces that I can explore that more. Thanks, Sam. And Handy, there's a lot more evidence that I was able to put here. I mean, if I was only going to make a presentation just of the charcoal producers, I would have to ask Rogério actually to give a presentation, because he's been the main geographical investigator, and he has found a lot of archaeological evidence together with the charcoal kilns. So there are bottles, like really old wine bottles that were used as water bottles, for example, or tools. So axe, these fragments of axe, fragments of rakes that are used, you know, to rake the coal. And not more than that, because it was really low demanding in terms of technology. It was just a lot of manpower, a lot of time invested in the fields, and it was really the work of the excluded population. So after 1888, when they abolished slavery, they had to resort to some sort of work, and what the type of work that remained for most of the ex-enslaved population was the one that nobody wanted to do. So working with coal hidden in the forests was basically the only work that was left to do. Okay, so thanks for the question, Handy. Maybe I can put a reference here, or Rogério can put a reference here of one of his papers that explains more of the archaeological evidence of charcoal producers in the Atlantic forest. For the second round, we have Mikael and Sandro. In this order, it could be Mikael.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's really great presentations. So I have some questions for all of you. First to Reinaldo. Of course, yesterday we were talking about possible connections between Mexican and Cuban geographers. So I did a little searching, and I did find out that Pastor Rue was a socio-corresponsal, or a corresponding member of the Cuban Society of Geography. And that's actually Luis Enrique Ramos Guadalupe who wrote about that in a paper. So that might be a useful way to, you know, look at some of these membership lists, and, you know, to see where, you know, people in different countries might have been interacting in some way. And I'm also thinking too, like, in response to Sam's question, well, you know, oh, they both went to Colombia, you know, maybe they knew each other, and yeah, possibly, but I think it's also important to figure out whether they corresponded, because, you know, people also corresponded just by, you know, way before the email and so forth, or even telephone, people wrote each other letters, right? So that you know, that's the way of trying to figure that out. So, but more specifically, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about Massip and his wife's influence on Antonio Núñez Jiménez, especially like, you know, the geography textbook that Núñez Jiménez published under Batista, that then Batista banned. You know, how much of their influence is in that geography? Because when you showed all the things that Massip did, I couldn't help but think, wow, that's kind of similar to what Núñez Jiménez was writing about in his textbook that Batista considered so subversive, right? The other thing was, you know, I assume Sara faced a lot of, you know, sexism and machismo, just, you know, because it was so hard to be a woman in this field. And I wonder if you have evidence about that. So those are just some questions that came out. And then for Ana and Alex, it's too bad Pedro didn't present, because last year at Stanford, when I had him for the Solcha workshop, he gave a presentation and I asked him this very question, you know, was there any sort of concern about Carl Sarro being a US citizen, you know, and kind of using a US based scholars, you know, whatever discipline or conceptual framework? Was there, you know, any kind of nationalist reaction to that? And I know, Ana, you put up in your slide something about anti-Americanism, and I wonder if, was there that kind of feeling at all towards Sauer? I mean, even though he was a progressive in the United States, a New Dealer, I'm just curious whether that was the case at all for Brazil. And then just very lastly, you know, of course, and I'm sure you hate having to hear this, but you know, anybody knows about Brazilian environmental history knows about Warren Dean's book, right? And I noticed neither of you mentioned it. And, you know, it's a classic declensionist narrative, but I couldn't help but this charcoal story seems to be a counter narrative to that, you know, that it was extractive, but then it allowed the forest to regrow somehow. So would you say that this sort of is a potential counter narrative to what Dean is writing about? I mean, obviously on a small scale, but anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent questions. Sandro.
I would like to compliment Ana and Alex and also Reinaldo for your fascinating presentation today. And I'd like to compliment the biological and historical ecology laboratory, and Rogério is here with his group, and Alex and everyone. I have to say that the work that this lab has been done in the fields of historical geography and environmental history is remarkable. So my compliments. And I have a question. We have actually we have debating this this topic related to how some hidden characters like woodcutters or the mateiros and also the carvoeiros, as they are a silence actors in environmental history of Brazil. And indeed, they played a very important role in the conquering and the process of deforestation, and also into this interesting paleo-territorial explanation that you have been dealing with. So my question is, are you thinking, have you been thinking to include more or to talk more about those characters and how to write about their influence and leaving that registers in the forests? As I'm so excited to read more about the mateiros, because they are fascinating characters, and I believe that the carvoeiros and the charcoal man, they have played the same role. So my questions to you guys is that one. And I have another question to Reinaldo. Reinaldo, I am here with your book, and so it's a fascinating book. And
thank you.
And I suffer. Reinaldo, my question is that I'm so fascinated by your argument related to the role of geographers in helping to build this what I don't know if I can say that obsession of development that was occurring not only in Latin America, but around the world. And you will find these environmental histories and papers in the Soviet Union, in China, but also in Latin America. And the geographers played a very interesting role in to build this kind of obsession of developmentalism. And one fascinating part of your book is when you mention the bulldozers who were invading the Cuba territory in a war against nature. And my question is, how geographers, with their expertise, at the same time as having a scientific power, but also a political one at the time, how they reinforce this kind of war against nature? Because in Brazil, we have a kind of a war against nature in the play that the bulldozer played for the conquering of the Amazon. For example, with Bernardo Sayão and the build of the Belém-Brasília road. And when he died, the government declared a war against nature, say, we are going to conquer the nature. You have the same narrative in your book. And I would like to know how the geographers have this kind of relationship with this bellico and this warfare narrative. So thank you, Reinaldo, and thank you, Alex and Anna.
Reinaldo, you want to start?
Alex, but I don't know how much time we have. Just briefly, yeah, maybe there is a difference between this notion in Brazil and Cuba, because this geographer in Cuba, they add over a landscape almost completely transformed. And then they speak more about restoration of nature, to organize the nature that others destroy. And that is maybe a different with Brazil, with a lot of natural forest, no, in that moment. But it's true, it's interesting, that obsession about development, not only in the geographers, no? But I found something interesting, because even when they had this kind of obsession, the obsession is different from the economists, for example, from others. They take in consideration all this other aspect of the restoration of nature, forestation, for example, no? And the use of water, the more rational use of nature. And then that's maybe a difference between Brazil and Cuba in the 60s, for example, no? But I understand, no, that there are a lot of similarities also. And we don't have time. For example, I would like to answer more to Michael, but they both had a huge influence on Núñez Jiménez and other geographers in that generation, and many similar histories. For example, one of their books about Geography of Cuba was also banned by the Machado dictatorship because they opposed, and the book was published 10 years after. I think the fact here maybe is their anti-imperialist, the beginning of this confrontation towards the so-called fatal determinists over Cuba regarding the relation with the United States. And we can extend this also to the rest of Latin America, no? And that it was kind of the will of the Cuban people to be self-sufficient, for self-determination, opposing that kind of geography that say that nothing was possible against or without the United States, no? And that's some of the difference maybe between a country as Cuba in our geographical position and Brazil, a big country more to the south with a similar but at the same time different relations with the United States. But I think we need also explore more this kind of connection between Cubans, geographers, and Brazilians, Cuban intellectuals in general, and Brazilians, Mexicans, and others with the same kind of concern. And of course, their relation with the United States Academy also that influenced their work. I found the same in Cuba, maybe not a huge influence by Sauer, but we need to take in consideration also that many of the relations in the Cuban Academy in that time, or maybe in Brazil also, was with the East Coast, with New York and other places in the East Coast. And thank you very much for your question, and we will continue this conversation in different ways.
Reinaldo, I'm gonna also try to answer quickly because of the time, but Anna, if you want to start, or
Okay, thanks for the questions. Mikhail, it's something that we are researching. We are starting this research, so maybe the anti-Americanism is related to the influence of French School of Geography. So there was no place for other influences. Although Brian Barry influenced urban geography, for example. So in Brazil, I heard once from Kent Mathewson that in Brazil, the only Sauberian, but not as a disciple, as an influenced one, was Ilger Steinberg, who was an American and was teaching in Brazil. So he supervised 3 or 4 theses that are related, influenced by Carl Sauer, but there's no direct disciple from Sauer. So anti-Americanism related to this influence from French school, maybe, we don't know.
yeah, I would say French school is prominent. A little bit of the German school is also, especially in physical geography. But as a geographer trained in Brazil, there was something I noticed. It's not just American geography or Carl Sauer's version of historical geography. It's Anglo-Saxon school of geography. So it's British, it's Australian, it's the English language. Seems that not only was it a barrier, but it was not chosen as the language to study. Aside from Portuguese, it was French. So French was the language of choice of Brazilian intellectuals. So that kind of in itself created a major filter, and that extended itself up into the late 90s. I think now in the past 20 odd years, we might be seeing, you know, more influences, more generalized, also including American geography, but unfortunately, it's something more recent. And you definitely noticed, right there. I do think that at least we're attempting for a counter declensionist narrative because, well, first of all, and personally, I find the narrative a little bit too depressing, and I think it is also part of our not only jobs to find other narratives inscribed in the landscape, also reveal them. And I think it's fundamental to find these stories and to publish them and tell other stories, because if not, humanity is, you know, going to lose itself just from its own sheer hatred of itself. And I find a lot of that as a professor, especially when I taught in biology department, how the declensionist narrative is really entrailed in natural sciences, and you know how humanity has lost its way. So we have to save nature. In order to save nature, we have to get rid of humanity. So I think we're trying to find something else and find these stories inscribed in the landscape, and also help people understand their own histories, be it their own society's history, their own cultural history, their own personal history, by understanding forest history. And os mateiros, Sandro, there are some interesting mateiros. That's definitely a gap. I know that the mateiros from the Tinguá area have been studied by the biology department, especially ethnobiology. So that's another field that people, I think, have to kind of talk together with environmental history, is, you know, the ethnoecology, ethnobiology. So that's something that can also help understand the historical aspect of landscapes. I definitely agree with you, Sandro. Okay. Marina, how are we with time? I think we're all.
Let me add something, Alex.
Sí.
Yeah, not just, I forgot to say, of course, after the 1959, we had a huge influence from the Soviet geographers and others, and maybe that is a little different from other Latin American countries. Then less influence from the United States, from Sauer, that's changed. We had also a big influence from the French geographers, human geographers, but the relation with the Soviets, Chinese, and other from this Eastern Bloc is interesting in the Cuban case.
I'd like to add also, as Reinaldo, that the influence of American geographers in Brazilian geography, which was much more related to the division between UFRJ, or the University, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the beauty of Brazilian Institute of Geography and the Brazilian Council of Geography, especially because that institution, their crew, they moved to the United States for their master and PhD studies. And since that time, the influence of Latin Americanists, like as I'm going to present tomorrow, like Preston James, Robert Platt, Robert Pendleton, Clarence Jones, Leo Weibel from Wisconsin. So that influence at IBGE were much more impact much more the Brazilian geography than the geography which was produced in the University of São Paulo, much more related to the French geography. So at that time, and I have an interesting interview with the German geographer Gerd Kohlhepp in ALAC, published probably the last issue of 2020, where Kohlhepp mentioned this kind of symbolic confrontation of power between those two distinguished universities in Brazil in the Department of Geography. One much more influenced by French geography, and another one influenced much more by the United States and geography that was produced in the US. And I'm so fascinated by that, and I would like to know much more. This is going to be part of my research, how Sauer in a certain way influenced, and I think Anna, you could be helpful your work, how Sauer influenced this kind of beauty in Latin Americans. For example, even Robert Platt in Chicago and Preston James in Syracuse, both were part of the Latin Americanists, and both were interested in South America, especially in Brazil. So this is another fascinating topic, and puts this international geographical perspective in evidence. So thank you so much. And I'd just like to add this.
Thank you. I think this is all the time that we have. I'd like to thank everybody that stayed until the end and accompanied our discussion. Again, thank you to Sandro and Marina for hosting today's session and helping organize. And tomorrow at 3 p.m. is the last day of the Geographers session. And Sandro will be giving a talk tomorrow. Marina also, right? And Claudia Leal. There you go. It's okay. Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you guys tomorrow.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Bye. Tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.